Okay, guys, as I said before, I'm going to go ahead and add chapter 23 from the beginning. Core 2, we were already finished with chapter 23. So if you want to review it, you may, but you do not have to. Core 2 and 4, you guys, we were about halfway through. So you could go back and start at the beginning. And you remember that Yannick was at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and he had just finished his death march where he had helped the young man, lost his bread, and had hoped we had the big discussion about how he had lost his humanity and maybe had hoped that perhaps the young man would pass away and he could get his bread in the morning, or even in the end, he decided whether he passed away or not, he was just going to steal the bread. But the young man woke up and caught him, and I was kind of frustrated, and you and I were kind of frustrated with the fact that the boy didn't even say thank you, nothing. And Yannick has gone without food and somehow managed to survive. So here we are, chapter 23. 3 days later, I staggered through the gates of Sachsenhausen. I barely knew where I was or who I was. All I remembered of the last 3 days was an enormous radio tower in the distance, growing larger and larger as we marched. That's Berlin, someone had said. That tower is in Berlin. The tower was in Berlin, but we weren't. We were in Sachsenhausen. And I was so tired and hungry that I didn't care if I lived or died. Death seemed like such a welcome release. If the Nazis had put us right to work, I might have died that day. I might have curled up on the ground like a Mussulman and never gotten up again. But they sent us to our barracks instead, where they fed us soup and bread. I was starving. I had been without food for days now, with only snow to eat each morning before we began to walk again. But all I wanted to do was sleep. When would they let us lie down? They wouldn't let us get in our bunks yet, so I sipped at the soup. It was nothing better than flavored water, but it was warm. So blessedly warm. My dry mouth tried to hang on to every last drop as I swallowed it down. The bread I couldn't eat, not yet. I didn't put it in the waist of my pants this time, though. I clung to it like it was a precious jewel, hoarding it like a dragon. At last, they told us it was time to sleep, and I crawled up into a single bed with 5 other men. There were so many of us, we couldn't sleep on our backs, but I fell asleep right away just the same. Just being out of the cold felt like paradise. It seemed I had just closed my eyes when morning came and the capos roused us out of our beds. In the light of day, we could see the camp was filled with corpses. Sometimes they lay alone, up against the wall of a barrack, as though they had simply fallen asleep there. Sometimes there were piles of them, built neatly in rows of 4. One level turned this way, the next level turned that way. So they would stack evenly. Sometimes the bodies looked like they had just been tossed aside, where they had died in the middle of a path, one behind the latrine. I had seen death many times by now. I had seen men killed, and I had watched men die of starvation, cold, right in front of me. But here in Sachsenhausen, death was so common, so ordinary, that the dead were like fallen trees in the forest, so unremarkable that they were only moved when they got in the way. Before roll call we would wash, the Nazis told us. They marched us out to some pumps. There were no brushes, no soap, no towels, but I rinsed myself off anyway. The water was freezing, but I was filthy from the march as I ran a wet finger across my teeth. A sudden memory came, unbidden. I remembered the first day my mother had brought me home a toothbrush. I might have been no more than 3 or 4. The toothbrush was shiny and plastic and green. That moment seemed like a million years ago. Had I ever really owned something so amazing as a toothbrush? Had I ever really lived in a world with such wondrous things in it? Even the simplest of possessions seemed like treasures now. On the way to roll call, I ate what I could of last night's bread. I had clutched it throughout the night and woke to find myself still protecting it. The soup and sleep and bread had done me good. I was no prize now, all bones and skin and shaking hands. But I wasn't so far gone that I couldn't work. The Nazis lined us up for roll call near the front gate, which had the words, "Work makes you free" on it, just like at Auschwitz. Our new masters didn't seem interested in making us work, though, not right away. Instead, we stood at attention, our feet sinking into the freezing mud while they called out our numbers. Again and again, they went through the roll call. Sleet began to fall, and the Nazis left us standing in the yard while they went inside to warm themselves by the fire. They watched us from the windows, making sure none of us moved. We stood there for hours for no reason other than the delight of our captors. One man wiped the wet sleet from his face, and the Nazis saw him. They rushed outside to beat him and then ordered him to give what they called the Sachsenhausen salute. They forced him to squat with his hands held out in front of him. If he moved in any way, or if his arms lowered, or his legs moved, or he fell over on his side, the Nazis would kill him, and they would never let him up either. It was torture. Everyone could see that. Our legs were barely strong enough to hold us up, let alone squat for hours. Even a healthy person would fall over in time. The man's legs began to shake, and his arms started to quiver, but still he held the salute. It was only later, when the Nazis had resumed the roll call, and we were all had forgotten about him, that the man finally fell over. The Nazis ran over to beat him, but he never felt it. He was unconscious, maybe even dead. I didn't know. The guards dragged him away and never saw him again. Suddenly, one of the prisoners near the end of the line broke off and ran. The Nazis saw him right away and yelled for the guards at the gate to catch him, but he wasn't headed for the gate. In a stumbling, broken run, the prisoner threw himself on the high-voltage electric barbed wire that lined the fence. His body sparked and thrashed in the wires and bled as the barbs cut him. Within seconds, his body hung dead and limp. The Nazis had to turn off the electric fence to get him out. His shirt and pants were scorched with electricity, and his skin was black where the wires had touched him. I couldn't look. But at the same time, I couldn't look away. The Germans laughed as they threw his body down in front of us for everyone to see. "Would any other Jews like to throw themselves on the fence?" they asked. "Go now. We won't stop you. We'll be glad to be rid of you." No one else took them up on their offer. After roll call, we were finally put to work. I broke rocks again in the quarry pit. Why the Germans needed so much gravel, I never understood. But I broke big rocks into medium-sized rocks, and medium-sized rocks into small rocks, and small rocks into gravel for them. Pound, 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 my hammer getting heavier and heavier with each strike. At lunch, a half a dozen other young men were pulled away from our scant meals of watery soup and hard bread. We looked at one another nervously. What was it? What was it? Were we all going to be lined up along a trench and shot? I fought down waves of terror as I walked. Had I survived the death march and gotten my strength back, such as it was, all so I could die in a muddy ditch? I didn't want to die, not after surviving so long, not after coming so far. I scanned the camp as we walked, watching for where they was taking us. If it was a death pit, what would I do? Run, turn and fight, yell and scream? Or would I let them shoot me without fighting back, so that no one else would have to suffer because of me? But it wasn't a ditch the Nazis took us to. It was a soldiers' mess hall. I was even more confused. Were they going to feed us in the soldiers' canteen? No. It was a trick, of course. It was part of the Nazis' game. And in Sachsenhausen, they played the game with relish. The other boys and I were lined up in front of the soldiers' tables, and we were told to sing. For an hour, we were their choir, our weak, raspy voices serenading them as they laughed and talked and ate. And the food they ate, big heaping plates of meat and potatoes and gravy and steaming black coffee. I tried to look away so my stomach wouldn't rumble. Just the smell of it made my mouth water. They weren't going to feed us any of it, of course. When they were finished eating, we were sent back to our barrack, where we found no food left for us. That afternoon, they put me to work chopping firewood to heat the soldiers' quarters. Chop, 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 chop. Every swing meant survival, I told myself. Work to live. Live until the Allies came. There were planes overhead here, too, and the rumbles of explosions in the distance. Berlin was under attack. The war had come to Germany. But would the war end before the Nazis killed me? That night at roll call, the Sachsenhausen guards wanted entertainment. So they had a boxing tournament that made some of the prisoners be the boxers and forced the rest of us to watch. Okay, so remember how we talked about how he had changed a little bit here because of the way he talked about even the boy whose bread he wanted, that he tried to help. He started out with this noble idea, the same noble idea that he'd always had to help the boy. But then all of a sudden, his humanity has changed a little bit, and now he's wanting to survive. It's survival. His mind's not working. Well, I don't know. I don't know about you, but I think another thing that's changed him too is the whole ride in the train car toward Auschwitz, toward Birkenau, and knowing that it's a death camp. The whole situation with going into the gas chamber that ended up being a shower for him. That time that he spent, standing there underneath the shower heads, wondering what's coming out, the gas pellets or the water. It just kind of broke him a little bit. He's not as, I don't know, to me, there's not as much confidence as there used to be. I don't know. Mm-hmm. We'll get together in our Google Meets and talk about it more, but it just seems to me like now he has to keep telling himself, do what he has to do to survive. His confidence is shaken a little bit. He's more afraid, perhaps, than he was before.